in their life. And I think it's a remarkable sculpture in addition to. So, as I mentioned, the rate of depression in the general population, I think in the Philippines, although you seem like a very lively, happy people, so maybe it's only 2% instead of 3%. It's 3% in the United States. The more medical illness you have, the more likely you are to be depressed. So 6% of people seen in outpatient medical clinics are depressed. 12% of people in the hospital are depressed. About a quarter of cancer patients are depressed. So serious medical illness carries with it a substantial risk of getting depressed. This is a study that I hope will give a broader understanding of why people get depressed. It's a study that was published in the journal Science, which is the leading scientific journal in the United States a few years ago, by a New Zealand researcher named Avshalom Caspi. And Caspi studied a scientific journal in the United States a few years ago by a New Zealand researcher named Avshalom Caspi. And Caspi studied a particular gene that codes for what's called the serotonin transporter, and it basically involves one of the major neurotransmitters in the brain that has to do with depression. You may recognize the word serotonin because we talk about the newer antidepressants as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So there are some people who have a variant of this gene, the serotonin transporter gene, and if they do, and they encounter a stress, they are significantly more likely to become depressed. So they're not more likely to become depressed if they don't have any major stresses in their lives, but they are much more likely to get depressed than those who have the normal variant of that one gene. So you can think of depression as in part a genetic vulnerability. It's not that they're choosing to be sad or get absorbed in themselves, it's that they have a genetic vulnerability that makes them more likely to get depressed if adverse events occurs. So this means on the one hand that depression can run in families, that there can be people over generations who tend to get depressed, both major depression alone and also bipolar disorder, where people get really high, go out and spend all the money you have, don't need to sleep, and then crash. Then they get very depressed after that. There are strong family connections for bipolar, but also for just major depression. So understand that they have a biological problem like diabetes, like heart disease, where there are certain risk factors that they carry, and if they encounter stress, they're more likely to get depressed. One of the other worrisome things about depression is that it can complicate the course of another medical illness. So if you're depressed and you have heart disease or cancer, you're more likely to die sooner. So it's very important to diagnose and treat depression in medical illness because it can make the course of the disease worse. Not only do you feel worse while you've got it, but you actually may not live as long. And we tend to overlook depression in the medically ill because we think, well, of course she's helpless, she's got cancer. And of course she's not interested in eating, she's taking chemotherapy, and she's sick to her stomach. And of course she isn't sleeping, she's worried about her disease. Those can also be the symptoms of depression. And in particular, as tragically some of you know in this audience, if people start to talk about ending their lives, they start talking about killing themselves, it is very important to take that seriously. There's a kind of common myth that people who talk about it don't do it. I hate to say this, but that's just flat out wrong. It doesn't mean that everybody who says they might kill themselves is going to do it, but the odds that they ultimately will are higher. If somebody makes a suicide gesture or an attempt but doesn't complete it, that doesn't mean they're not serious. It means they're actually more serious than just talking about it. The other thing is, that is always a medical emergency. It's more than a family can handle. So if a family member, a loved one, is talking about killing themselves, you need to get psychiatric help for that. You can't handle it by yourself. And however, it is very important to talk about it with your loved one. Because think about it from the perspective of the depressed person. If you kind of float the idea, well, you know, I'm thinking about killing myself, and people don't respond, what's the message to them? The message to them is, you know what, we don't care. We don't go do it, you know. So you have to take it seriously. And you have to get help when you hear that. That's when psychiatric help is needed. But in the medical setting too, even without the thought of suicide, depression complicates. We found that 15 of 24 studies showed that depression accelerated the progression of cancer. This is a French cancer patient saying how hard she found the treatment to undergo. We found in our studies at Stanford that patients who in the initial year we studied them had worsening depression tended to live only 3 years after that, and those who had improving depression lived 5 years, so 2-year difference in survival. So it can make a big difference not only in how well but in how long people live. This is what's called the survival curve, and it shows that the ones who had worsening depression tended to die sooner than the ones who had improving depression. So treating depression should be an important part of cancer treatment. And we're now in the United States trying to make more comprehensive emotional and psychological care a part of overall cancer treatment. One of the things that we do is we have a program of group support for cancer patients. And I'll show you some examples of what we try to do to help people in these groups. And frankly, I suspect a lot of the process in our cancer groups are rather similar to the kinds of processes you have in support groups for families who have lost children, for example. So I'd like to go over some of the principles because social support is a powerful treatment. There are also very good medications for depression, but I want to focus on the social support. For those who do psychoanalysis, this is one model of group therapy. It's not the way we do it. We use chairs. So there are 7 themes that we focus on in these groups. And I will briefly go through each one of them with you to give you an idea about the themes. We have a book called Group Therapy for Cancer Patients, and for anyone who's interested, you can go on the web and get a copy of the book. It goes in detail into what we do. The first is building bonds, is making a new social network. There are some lovely women here all dressed in blue in row 6 who have sadly lost children to depression, but they formed a group to work together to help prevent other people from going through the same kind of problem that they did. And clearly they are drawn together. You know, you might think that people who have suffered such a tragedy would want to avoid anyone else who'd been through it, but they draw strength from one another, they help one another, they do painting together, they discuss their feelings, they formed a foundation to try and help others avoid the kind of issues in fact, I think you told me that they're the only foundation that don't want to have any new members. They don't want anyone else to have a need to join. But you find that people who have common serious problems like this are very much drawn together. There's a kind of social glue that holds them together. And I've had support groups of breast cancer patients meeting for 10 years or more. And some people have come virtually the entire 10 years. One woman said, this is the least superficial thing I do in my life, that it's where they can discuss whatever is bothering them. And even people who have very understanding family and friends feel that they're imposing something very painful on their loved ones, but among a group of people who all have the same problem, it's fair, because you may be upsetting her, but she's upsetting you, so it kind of balances out, you know. And the other thing is, there's nothing good about going through a tragedy like losing a child to suicide or getting breast cancer, but you've learned things about dealing with it that can genuinely help other people who have the same problem. So something genuinely good has come out of a bad situation, and that's something of tremendous value. One of my patients was a frustrated poet, and this is one of the poems she wrote. Most of us don't know, and those who do won't tell. So we build you a reason, a barrier to shut out any probing of our scars, self-inflicted or not. If you love us a little and let us weep when we must, we may find out who we are. The second thing is very important. I find Filipinos to be a very warm, open, expressive group of people. So you may not have the same kind of problem in dealing with emotion that we do in America. We tend to cover it up. We tend to want to put on a happy face and be optimistic, even when there's no reason to be optimistic. And I can assure you that the last 8 years in the United States have provided no reason at all to be optimistic about anything, except hopefully a change on November 4th, but that was not a political statement of any kind. We think it's very important to encourage people to openly address and feel the emotions they have in relation to their illness, that it can be a source of closeness rather than a source of isolation. Thomas Jefferson said, when angry, count 10 before you speak. If very angry, count 100. Mark Twain said, when angry, count to 4. When very angry, swear. I'm on the Mark Twain side of that one. I think people should be more open about how they feel. And we find that the very people who try the hardest to suppress their emotions wind up being more anxious and depressed. And if you think about it, here's how I believe it works. And I think this can be a path toward depression or away from depression. That is, if you don't want to deal with how bad you feel, you run from it, you still don't feel great, but you maybe in the short term you feel a little bit better. But the next time you feel bad, you're not as sure what it is that's making you feel bad. You know, is it the residue of the last thing, or is it the new stress? And so after a while, what happens is you just start feeling generally miserable, and you can't attribute it to any particular cause. And if you don't know what's making you sad or angry or fearful, you can't do anything about it. So you start to feel more and more helpless. So it's a kind of vicious cycle, where the more you avoid it, the more it kind of follows you, and the less you can do about it. So I encourage people to deal with situations that make them angry, fearful, or sad, and you're less likely to slide into depression or an anxiety disorder. This is an example of a French breast cancer patient doing that. She felt very much punished by her treatment and had this image of herself before she had lost her breast and had the surgery. So my goal is to convert anxiety into fear and depression into sadness. It's okay to be sad. In fact, I've had depressed patients who tell me, I just wish I could have a good cry. I feel miserable, but I can't even cry. So giving vent to the acute sadness is actually a treatment for depression. It's not a sign it's getting worse. And by the way, one other thing that I think is worth your keeping in mind, particularly for those of you who may be dealing with depressed loved ones who have thought of suicide, one of the most dangerous times is when the depression is getting better. Now that doesn't seem to make sense, but when people are really darkly depressed, they don't have the energy to do anything. They can't plan anything. They just feel overwhelmed and sad. When you treat them with psychotherapy, with medication, or if just over time they're getting better, they may still have all the depressive ideas, but now they've got some energy and they can plan it. And so we watch depressed patients even more carefully while they're coming out of the depression than we do when they're at their worst. Because you can be put off. You can think, oh, finally he's getting better. You know, it's going to be fine. It's a very dangerous time, so you have to keep an eye on people as they're coming out of their depression. Shakespeare, as usual, said it best, give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the oft-wrought heart and bids it break. We found that we were actually able to change the way our patients manage their emotions. So they were less likely to suppress their anger, fear, and sadness. That's the yellow line down here. They're getting less, they're becoming more Italian here. They're showing more feeling than the control patients. And yet, they felt that they were managing their emotions better. You know, there's a tendency for people to say, well, you know, if I start crying, I'll never stop. You know, the Pandora's box is open. I'll never get the feelings back in. And I have never yet lost a patient in terminal crying. You know, they start crying, they stop, and they feel better. I tell the medical students at Stanford, if you see a patient crying, don't just do something, stand there. You know, we tend to want to rush in and fix it. Don't do it, it makes things worse. And I'm going to show you an example of that, because one of the things we try to do is to help people face even concerns about dying and death. Now, death is an overwhelming concept. Many people get comfort from their religious faith in dealing with their fears of dying and death. Some have other ways of dealing with it, existential or otherwise. Some just can't understand it or deal with it. There's nothing any of us can do about the fact that we die, but there's a lot that we can do about the way that we die. We can deal with fears of being isolated from loved ones, treatment decisions in medical care, dealing with pain. Those are